You know, when we think about World War II in America, there's one name that always comes up: the Good War. It's this powerful, deeply ingrained story of a noble crusade against pure evil. But here's the thing about history: it's almost never that simple. So in this explainer, we're going to pull apart that narrative and take a hard look at the complicated and often brutal reality hiding underneath. And this quote right here, it just nails the popular memory of the war in the States. The core idea was this feeling of absolute moral clarity, a black and white mission against evil. So that's our starting point. That's the story we're all familiar with and the one we're going to dig into. And let's be totally clear, there are some really powerful reasons for this perspective. I mean, the US absolutely played a massive role in defeating the Axis powers. The war did punish horrific aggression. It helped kickstart a wave of decolonization. And what's pretty remarkable, America helped generously rebuild its former enemies. These are historical facts, and they're a huge part of the story. But that isn't the whole story, not even close. So let's start peeling back the layers with our first section here, focusing on the brutal reality of the American war effort, especially in the Pacific. And that's really the central question we have to ask ourselves, right? Was the conduct of the war as morally clear-cut as its outcome? The sources we've looked at suggest a much, much more complicated picture. When we talk about mass civilian destruction in Japan, our minds immediately go to the atomic bombs. But look at this number. Before Hiroshima was ever a target, American conventional firebombing campaigns had already, and I mean completely, destroyed more than 60 Japanese cities. And that number translates into a staggering human cost. Before a single atomic bomb fell, these so-called conventional bombing raids had already killed an estimated 310,000 Japanese civilians. And we need to be clear, this wasn't just collateral damage. It was a deliberate strategy of targeting entire cities for annihilation. So how did the US Army Air Forces view this at the time? Well, this official assessment from 1945 frames the entire campaign as a spectacular success, a victory of colossal devastation achieved at a slight cost. But that slight cost only refers to American lives, standing in just stark contrast to the hundreds of thousands of Japanese non-combatants who died. Okay, so that brings us to the atomic bombs themselves and the huge ethical questions that surround them. On one side, you have the argument for military necessity, that it was a terrible but necessary act to end the war and save lives. But you have to weigh that against the other side, the fact that Japan had already been trying to surrender and that the bombs were dropped on cities to maximize civilian death. It raises these profound questions about whether it was even legal under the rules of war. And the questioning gets even sharper when you look at Nagasaki. I mean, it was dropped just 3 days after Hiroshima. Its military necessity is far more debatable. Many historians argue it served completely different purposes: to test a new kind of plutonium bomb, and maybe, more importantly, to send a terrifying message to the rest of the world about America's new power. All right, let's move to our next section. We're going to shift from grand strategy to some deeply disturbing acts that were often deliberately hidden from the public. This is where the simple narrative really starts to fall apart. One of the victors' darkest secrets was the practice of human trophy collection. And no, this wasn't just a few isolated incidents. It was a known practice where some American soldiers in the Pacific would mutilate the bodies of dead Japanese soldiers to take home these grisly souvenirs. Skulls, teeth, ears, you name it. And if you think that sounds like something on the absolute fringe, get this. In 1944, a sitting U.S. congressman actually gave President Roosevelt a gift, a letter opener carved from the arm bone of a Japanese soldier. Now, FDR did eventually have it returned for a proper burial, but the fact that it was offered as a gift in the first place, that speaks volumes. Now, we need to talk about one of the most infamous war crimes of the entire conflict, this one committed by the Japanese. I'm talking about Unit 731. This was a secret biological warfare unit that performed horrific, lethal experiments on thousands of living human beings, most of them Chinese civilians. The details are monstrous. So where's the victor's secret here? Well, after the war, the United States wanted that research data. So in a covert deal, America granted full political immunity to the doctors and the commanders of Unit 731. These war criminals never faced justice. In exchange, they handed over all their research, which was derived from torture and murder. You can just feel the outrage, even from the people who were supposed to be delivering justice. This is a quote from Judge Burt Rolling, who served on the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. He expresses this deep bitterness at finding out that the US government had actively hidden these crimes from the very court he was serving on. There's another deeply disturbing and long-ignored crime we have to address: sexual violence. After the brutal Battle of Okinawa in 1945, historical sources are clear that there was widespread rape of local women by American soldiers. Now, getting exact numbers is obviously impossible given the circumstances, but one academic estimate based on deep historical research suggests that as many as 10,000 women may have been victims. According to these sources, it was a crime on a massive scale. So, why was this a long-kept secret? Why don't we hear about this? Well, the reasons are complicated. There was the shame and fear of the victims, of course, but there was also official censorship by the US military. And crucially, there was a collective desire to protect the clean, untarnished image of the good war and its heroes. All of this brings us to our final section, the complicated legacy of these events. How have they shaped not just history, but our memory of it ever since? And this is the big question hanging over this whole explainer, isn't it? Why is so much of this absent from the popular American story of the war? Well, a big part of the answer lies in how different nations dealt with everything that came after. This table paints a really stark picture. In the decades after the war, both Germany and Japan went through these intense, often painful periods of national reflection about what they had done. But in the United States, there has been virtually no comparable critical reflection on its own wartime atrocities. It's just not part of the conversation. And you have to understand, this isn't just dusty old history. Sources argue that the tactics perfected in World War II, especially targeting civilians with overwhelming air power to keep American casualties low, became a defining feature of the American way of war in Korea, in Vietnam, and in conflicts right up to the present day. So it all comes down to this really important concept that historians call victor's justice. Basically, winning the war gave the US the power to define what a war crime was and who should be punished for it. But as this source points out, that very privileged position has made it incredibly difficult for America to turn that same critical lens back on itself. And that leaves us right here with this final, challenging question. It's the very standard that was proclaimed at the Nuremberg trials. Should all nations be judged by the same principles? Reconciling the heroic story of the good war with its much darker realities forces us to ask if that ideal has ever truly been met. And it really complicates how we remember even our most celebrated victories.